Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm continuing my trek through the era known as the Disney Renaissance from 1989 to 1999, so all of my childhood. We are slowly but surely nearing the end of it, and now we are in the section of it where each film in a row I actually saw in theaters. Because we went from The Lion King, which I saw in theaters, to Pocahontas, which I did not see in theaters, even though I had the VHS and I still have that copy that I would watch a lot growing up. And then the previous entry, I don't believe I saw in theaters. But now, of course, with this film, up until the end of this era, I saw each and every one of them in theaters at least once. And I can say I saw them all at the same theater, too. The Regal Theater that eventually became Diamond Cinema, and that's what it's still known as today, almost 20 years after it reopened. Even though, unlike that, it's no longer independently owned and operated. But anyway, this, of course, is from 1997. This is Hercules. Directed, of course, by John Musker and Ron Clements, who both did Aladdin, and, of course, Musker go on to make a film in a couple years' time after this film that I still have not watched, but it's on the watch list, which I'll discuss when I talk about the making of this film. This film was made for $85 million, turned a profit about $252.7 million, so made money, but you could see the continuing downward trend of the films, which is an interesting thing to see because the films made money, but then they're slowly going downhill. And even though I like Lion King, I don't think that should have been the peak financially, but I think this is when it's because of how many of these films are being released and there's not a lot of time in between them. It's year after year. I think that's when we're probably going to start seeing the diminishing returns. And also probably the shine off the rose, considering the movement and all that. But these films are still good. Now, Hercules, this is one that it still is a fun film to watch. I can definitely say that when you're watching this entire era as a whole, it's not as good, but that's the only time it eats that is when you're being compared to Beauty and the Beast, being compared to Hunchback. It's only bad by comparison. And I'd say probably the previous film, Aladdin, I like a little bit better. But this is still a good film. And of course, it's only bad if you look at it for what it's adapting, because if you think about it, Hercules is essentially how Zeus would want humans to view him in a good light. Because if you look at mythology, Zeus is not this type of person. And of course, there's the whole thing about, this tale that they're adapting is a tragedy, so the fact that they go the whole musical, comic book inspired superhero route, it's a little interesting. But if you're going to go with a family friendly version of Greek mythology, this is the perfect lens in which to go with it. Now, Musker and Clements also helped write the screenplay along with Donald McInerney, Bob Shaw, and Irene Michi. Like I said, that name's going to pop up. The music, of course, was once again done by Alan Menken with lyrics by David Zippel, who also wrote lyrics for The Swan Princess, the following film, Mulan. And interesting, he also did the lyrics for a certain song from the MCU. He's a star-spangled man. Which I'm like, that's a little interesting connection when you think about it. And this film has the voice talents of Tate Donovan as Hercules. Around this time, we also did the Memphis Belle and Murder at 1600. We got Susan Egan as Megara, Hercules' love interest. She, in more recent years, is known for voicing Pink Diamond / Rose Quartz. Sorry if I spoiled that. Over in Steven Universe, but before this, she also played Belle in the Broadway version of Beauty and the Beast. So, who better to play a heroine in one of these films? Of course, the legendary James Woods voices Hades, and it is James Woods, of course, Danny DeVito, voicing Phil Octides, or as he says, call him Phil, the trainer character. Of course, Zeus himself is voiced by Rip Torn, who, of course, this is not his first foray into Greek mythology, as he would later voice Hephaestus in God of War 3. I got Samantha Eggar voicing Hera. She was also in, of course, the original Dr. Dolittle film from 1967. You got Paul Schaefer as Hermes, and it's a brief role, but you got Charlton Heston briefly voicing the narrator at the beginning. Perfect little casting choice there. And it's also very minor. I never really noticed it as a kid, maybe because he's not using as much of his bass inflection, but you got Keith David in there briefly voicing Apollo. Most of his lines are in the third act of the film, but he is in there. And of course we got Amanda Plummer, Carol Shelley, and Patty Edwards as the Fates. And there's some more I could throw in there, but I think you get the gist. It's a stacked cast, which that's one thing a lot of these Disney films in this era are known for, and it's something that would continue onward into the more modern era. Now, the creation of this film goes back to early 1992. 30 artists, writers, and animators, they were pitching ideas for a potential animated feature. Now, of course, this is still the early era of the Disney Renaissance, because at this point, only 3 of the films had come out. The one that started it, of course, The Little Mermaid, Rescuers Down Under, and this is right in the wake of Beauty and the Beast. So we're riding high, but we haven't quite hit the peak financially. Several other films are still in production or about to be released. Aladdin, Lion King, Pocahontas. So Katzenberg and the others are looking for ideas of what to do afterwards. Now, one idea that was pitched here was the Odyssey, which, if you know your Greek mythology, you know that tale. And of course, given the whole epic musical thing that's going around right now, the tale of the Odyssey is having a renaissance, I guess you could say, of its own. Now, production for this idea was abandoned due to the fact that the Odyssey was viewed as too long, which for a theatrical length film, especially the length they like to get for a Disney film, which is 70 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on the tale, I could see, because even in its most streamlined form, the Odyssey is more for like miniseries or TV series, unless you're going to make like an epic film, or, as the film The Return just showed, adapt only one part of the story. It lacks central characters. I disagree with that viewpoint entirely. It does have central characters. It just depends on how you're going to do your focus. And this is the one that's like, yeah, definitely, this is the death nail. Failed to translate to animated comedy. Yeah, unless you're going like the adult animation route, a la Heavy Metal, it's kind of hard to adapt the Odyssey in this same light. I mean, it's possible. I mean, as this film showed, you can adapt Hercules, but I think he probably translates a little bit more than the Odyssey, considering some of the subject matter. Calypso. Animator Joe Hayden pitched a Greek mythology story despite this cancellation, but he changed the focus to Hercules. Now, this original idea involved the Trojan War, but it slowly segued into the final idea. But this early on, some of the themes that are in this final product were there. Hercules makes a choice without considering the consequences, although they modified that to him making the choice to save someone that was dear to him. He learns humility and strength is not always the answer, which is, of course, the final lesson that he keeps in the final film, which is, a true hero is not always about the size of his strength, but the strength of his heart. But Aiden's involvement, of course, this is as far as I went with it. And following Aladdin's success, Clements and Musker were redeveloping an idea that would eventually turn into Treasure Planet. Now, Katzenberg, like I said, he's going to still be involved here a little bit, but his involvement in a lot of these later films is going to slowly dissipate because he leaves and he goes to DreamWorks. He disapproved of the Treasure Planet project based on the then current treatment, which if I ever get around to reviewing Treasure Planet, we'll probably talk about all this. But he suggested they adapt A Princess of Mars. Kind of interesting, because even though Disney lost the rights for that at the time, they would eventually come back around and do their own, adaptation of that source material. Of course, they passed, but Katzenberg made a deal with them. It was like, hey, you make a commercially viable film for me, I'll greenlight your passion project, which is a deal you'll see a lot of times in Hollywood. I mean, it's the main reason that Scorsese did a remake of Cape Fear. That was his commercial film in return for one of his passion projects. I mean, sometimes you could definitely tell they are just the paycheck type film, but if you are an auteur like Scorsese, it's only by comparison. Now, films that they turned down Don Quixote, which is kind of hard to imagine in a Disney style, but would have been interesting. The Odyssey, once again, and Around the World in 80 Days. Now, that film, I'm curious to see how that would have turned out in the animated style. Eventually, Disney would do their own live-action version of it in 2004 with, a star-studded cast. I mean, one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's last films before he went into The Governor. No, anything but my statue of me. But an animated version of it in the Disney style, I think, would have been very interesting. And this is what Mesker had to say on Hercules when that idea was presented to him and why they decided to go with it. We thought it would be our opportunity to do a superhero film. Ron and I being comic book fans, the studio likes us moving on to that project. Which, going at the whole Hercules mythology and looking at it through the lens of a superhero film, comic books and all that, is a good way to adapt it through if you're going to go and make it more family friendly. Because there's a lot of stuff in the mythology that, yeah, you could do it in a PG-13 or above film, but it's not going to be something that, it's just something the kids technically could watch, but it's not what you would call family friendly. Because there's a lot of stuff in Greek mythology that's like, oh yeah. But filtering it through this type of lens definitely makes it more Disney palatable. And it's interesting to see that, but of course it makes it to where the story is like in a floating Greek mythology timeline, where they can reference just about anything that happens in the mythology, even though if you know your loose timeline of it, you're like, wait a minute, Hercules is before this, but he's after this. It's one of those weird things, but it adds to the humor because you're like, wait a minute, he would have been on that, so that mask should not be there. He would have been after that, he would have been before that, but it's one of those things that if you are a Greek mythology nerd, it could get you chuckling a little bit, but also, depending on how anal retentive you are, it could also be like, ugh. It also makes for good material, but it's also one of those things that this is your introduction to Greek mythology. If you go back later and watch it again, you're like, oh, I get those references now. Now, Mesker and Clements conducted research with extensive notes, those references show, and stuff they added was a naive title character stuck between worlds, a Danny DeVito sidekick, a world-wise heroine, and a powerful villain in a battle of idealism versus cynicism. And of course, they also researched some screwball comedies to add that to it. One example they brought up was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I mean, if you're going to research screwball comedies, go with Jimmy Stewart. He was the best at that. And of course, like I already mentioned, the whole thing about them not going the traditional story due to the subject matter. And in addition to the whole superhero thing, Hercules' popularity is compared to modern athletes. I mean, we see a lot of that in the film. I mean, Air Herc and being very popular, him being an action figure. And some of that you could probably go from Michi, bring in additional humor to the final drafts, which definitely helps the film. If this was a humorless film, it definitely wouldn't work as much. Well, once they got from the story treatments down to looking at who would they cast, one person that was approached for Hades was Jack Nicholson. And this was a Danny DeVito suggestion, which obviously they worked together, they're friends, so it makes sense. Now, he turned down a $500,000 offer, which kind of makes sense because at this time he usually made $10 to $15 million, and that was what he countered with, plus 50%. Now, part of me wants to say that the main reason he did this is because of how Disney treated Robin Williams a few years earlier when it came to Aladdin, where they had him pay for that, and he said, okay, I'll do it for that as long as you do not use me in marketing, and then they turned around and gave him the finger on it. And Nicholson is so much of a businessman, he probably saw that, so he's like, if they're going to do, he's probably like, well, if they're going to do this, I'm going to make sure they pay out the nose for it. And of course, Disney ended up passing at that one, which, just look at what the budget was, yeah, that would have added a good amount to it. Now, then they hired John Lithgow, but for some reason his version wasn't working, so they ended up firing him in '95. And of course, other people they considered to fill the role were Ron Silver, James Coburn, Kevin Spacey, the legendary Phil Hartman, which I would love to have seen what that version would have sounded like, Rod Steiger, Michael Ironside, Terrence Mann, Martin Landau, all excellent actors. But of course, at this point, Hades was scripted as a slow, menacing character. And with the actors they're picking, I can see why they would go with him. Like, Kevin Spacey definitely would go with the slow, menacing vibe. You can see Michael Ironside working on it. But I think the reason a lot of these people aren't working is because of that thing. And that's probably also why Lithgow ended up not working. And it's also with that, it's like, why would you go with Nicholson? If that's the characterization you're going for. And it's not until they considered Woods that they decided to change it to the rapid fire style we see in the final film. Which, hearing that, it's like, if they had gone with that type of characterization from the beginning, they might have been able to get some of the other ones to work. But alas, we would have been robbed of James Woods' legendary vocal performance, which he loved this character so much, partially due to him ad-libbing so many lines, that he will return for this character no matter what. He returned for him in the animated series. He voices him in Kingdom Hearts, which he's one of the few celebrity voices to do that. And of course, when this film went over budget, he offered to return his salary and finished the film for free. And of course, Disney decided against this, and he finished the film anyway. And you could say what you will about him in his politics, but as an actor, he's excellent. He shows that he translates that well over to voice acting. Now, that's all about the backstory. Now let's talk a little bit about the plot. The plot of the film is, it takes place long ago in the faraway land of ancient Greece, as the narrator says it. It's a time of gods, monsters, heroes, and adventure. Now, as the narrator mentions it, one of the greatest of these heroes was the mighty Hercules. And of course, this film is essentially showing Hercules from his origin to what made him a mighty hero. Now, it starts with him being born on Mount Olympus, because in this version, Hercules is not a demigod because he is born from a godfather and a human mother, as is traditional in Greek mythology. He's a demigod because he was born a full god, which they all did that to skirt around the whole adultery thing. He's born a full god, and his powers were taken from him. Now, his powers were taken by his scheming uncle Hades, which, even though it works in the context of the film, if you know your Greek mythology, this is one of the slanderous moments, because Hades is one of the few gods that doesn't really do a lot of evil things to people. And plus, being a god of the underworld does not necessarily mean you are Satan, but that's definitely one of the lenses that Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions looked at it through. But getting that out of the way. In this film, it works for him being the villain. He's scheming because he wants to be in control, which kind of ties back to him being one of the older brothers and the whole drawing lots to figure out which one would rule what. They don't really bring up the lots. They kind of loosely mention that it was his dominion was bestowed on him. So you can see he doesn't like being god of the underworld. So he is scheming to free the Titans, which in this continuity, at least in the film, they're more generic, element-based ones. So I think they would fit more in line with the primordial deities than they would the Titans. And of course, it's another thing that kind of cut away some of the father-son dynamic from Greek mythology, because you don't see Kronos, even though from what I've read, I guess they do have him pop up in the TV show. I haven't seen it in years, so I can't comment. And you even got a Cyclops in there as a Titan. That's not a Titan, but oh well. Hades' plan is to free the Titans, attack Olympus, and take over. Now, according to the fates, he will succeed unless Hercules fights. So Hades wants to get Hercules out of the way. Now, his idea is to turn him mortal and then kill him, because that's the only way to kill a god. His plan mostly succeeds, but the potion that he has his minions, Pain and Panic, feed the little sunspot, as he calls him. works, except he does not drink the last drop. Now, in doing that, he becomes mortal, but he still retains his godlike strength, which allows him to fight off pain and panic, but also has him maintain that part of his godhood. Which is a nice little reference to how, in mythology, Hercules got his powers, which was from drinking a drink. So inverse it, and of course, make it a little bit more family friendly, because I don't think they're going to show teat sucking, at least that type of teat, in a Disney film. I gotta add that little asterisk there because of a scene in 101 Dalmatians. Now he is found by a human couple that raise him. Next time we see him as a teenager, we can see that he doesn't quite fit in, mainly due to his strength. And this is one of those things that watching it again, I'm like, really? This is an age of heroes. There should be other demigods running around. Are we really going to say that these people are going against Hercules because of that? Unless, since he's living on a farm, this is a part of Greece where they're like, yeah, we don't take too kind to you demigods coming around these here parts. Yeah, I never knew them demigod. I never did like them demigod people. You'll get it that way, it makes sense. But also the fact that he's caused tons and tons of damage, you can kind of see why the people don't really like him. And he doesn't really fit in, which of course leads to his Disney song, which continues the tradition that we started all the way back in Little Mermaid of the heroes' first song setting up their whole thing. In this one, it's, of course, Go the Distance, where Hercules is like, he's often dreamed of a far-out place where a welcome is waiting for him. And Going the Distance continues the whole sport analogy thing. And, of course, this is the song that would be turned into the pop version, sung in this film by Michael Bolton in the end credits, and I love that version of it. It's definitely one of those ones that's in every single one of my gym playlists, because it gets that in guitar riff, it's like, yeah, swole time. Hercules' parents tell him how they found him. He decides to go to the temple of Zeus to find answers. Zeus appears in the form of a statue and tells him everything, at least that he knows, and tells him the only way he can return to Mount Olympus is by becoming a true hero on Earth. He tracks down Phil. Phil trains him after some strong-armed persuasion. And of course he's fully trained up, and now he has to become a hero. Now it's a rough start, and during this he's introduced to Megara, and his continued existence is discovered by Hades, and Hades tries to kill him using the Hydra, but he manages to slay the Hydra after a very rough start. And this is one of the scenes where you can definitely see where all that money on the animation went, because it's an excellently animated fight, and you can definitely see they're still utilizing the CG that they started using in the last couple films, mainly for the Hydra's heads, where it's like all the Hydra heads. And of course you get a montage where Hercules fights other creatures, and essentially Hades throws everything he has at him, and it's not working, so he decides he's going to throw a different one. He's already tried Beast, now he's going to try Beauty, because he technically owns Megara's soul due to her deal with the devil she made with him. And it works all too well, because instead of it being a ploy, Hercules and Megara legitimately fall for one another, which of course leads to Meg's song, I Won't Say I'm in Love. You know, definitely showing off her pipes with that one. Her vocal pipes, don't go there, I already know what you were thinking. And of course, because of Hades seeing that it is an actual good weakness of Wonder Boy, as he calls him, leads to him making a deal. It falls through because of someone getting hurt, and you can tell in the end, Hercules does regain his godhood, which this is one of those scenes that's an epic one. I remember watching this in the theater and being like, okay, how's he going to get out of this? And then like, oh no. And just watching it again, it's an excellent moment. Hades thinks everything's going his way, and then boom, godhood returned. Because with this, the lesson that Hercules is learning in the last part of the film is that even though he's always had this godlike strength, him being a true hero, it doesn't go with the size of his muscles. It's not determined by the size of his physical strength. It's about the strength of his character, about his heart. And every action he'd been doing up until that point had been selfish, self-centered. It had all been just to reach his goal. He had not done anything without expecting that goal to be reached. Which you can kind of understand. I mean, it's his goal to return to Mount Olympus, but he's never done anything heroic without expecting that in the end. Nothing selfless. And of course, in the end, he does a lot of selfless things. I mean, he gives up his strength for a day to make sure the person he loves is saved. And I mean, of course, that's still selfish. But then he's even willing to sacrifice his life in order to make sure that she returns to the land of the living. And in doing so, he almost dies, but that is enough for him to be considered a true hero, which, of course, leads to the whole moment where the Fates try to cut his string and it doesn't work. And then, of course, he rises up. You can't be alive, you'd have to be a god. And, of course, Hades being a god, unless his godhood is stripped by something like the potion, it's kind of hard for him to get a comeuppance where he's dead. So the way they actually take him out, it fits, and of course continues with the whole falling trope. In the end, Hercules and Meg do get their happy ending. Don't go there. Hercules, of course, gets to stay on Earth, and it's a nice little ending for the film. And, of course, the whole musical numbers around it. Because I haven't really brought up a lot of the musical numbers, because there's really only the two traditional ones. The rest of them are the muses, who in this film are interpreted as like a gospel group, singing around Hercules, where we get the opening number, we get Zero to Hero, the main one they do, and then of course the Star is Born at the end. Now, it's different, and for this type of film, it definitely works, because you get the muses doing the whole Greek chorus thing, so a nice little callback to the source material, but in a more modern lens, without having to constantly come up with musical numbers for the characters. Because some of these characters, I'm not quite sure musical numbers would have worked. Because it's kind of hard to imagine Hades with his own villain musical number, even though it would have been interesting to hear James Wood sing. It's hard to imagine it. And with how the film flows, other characters besides Herc and Meg having musical numbers really would have interrupted the flow. Oh yeah, there's one other musical number. Oh yeah. Before someone mentions it, of course, there's Phil's musical number, which definitely fits because it adds to the training montage, and of course we get a Karate Kid reference in there. It's nice to see that there, especially now in the wake of Cobra Kai's finale. Now, like I mentioned, the animation on the film, wonderful. Compared to the previous film and the next one, it's very bright and very cartoony, I guess you could say, but that, and I mean that in the good way. Even though it's like, what? It's animation. Of course it's cartoony. It's that all the colors and all that, it make it very bright, and you definitely tell the comic book superhero influence on the film. And it definitely fits with the whole aesthetic. And you can definitely tell they did their Greek mythology research in some of the designs, especially the backgrounds and all that. How they interpret the gods is interesting. They're going a lot with the element thing, like Neptune being very fishy. And of course, going with Hades being the god of the dead, you know, they're going with the whole fire thing. I mean, it doesn't really jive with the mythology, but it adds some interesting dynamics for him being the evil one. And of course, we get some comedy thing there. And kick some Olympian butt! What, is my hair out? Little gags like that. And of course, his fire turning different colors depending on his mood. And of course, Pain and Panic being like traditional demons in appearance. Of course, Kerberos, his giant dog. Music, I already mentioned, excellent. The voice work, all around, excellent. Of course, you got Jim Cummings in there a couple times. And this is what Rotten Tomatoes had to say on this film. Fast-paced and packed with dozens of pop culture references, Hercules might not measure up with the true classics of the Disney Pantheon, but it's still plenty of fun. Now, I would definitely say that when you put it in the Disney Renaissance one, it's definitely in the middle to mid-high, which when I go to the end of this and actually rank them, we'll see where exactly it is. Of the films older than the Renaissance, it's probably only the top tier ones I would put above this, like Fantasia, maybe Snow White. I haven't seen that film in ages, so I don't know where I'd rank it overall. But definitely the top tier ones are above it, but it's like about in the same area as like the average Disney film from the past. Not to say this film is average, but by comparison you would put it there. I mean, I might even put some of the more recent ones above it, but we'll see. We'll have to wait and see when I'm done with it. But with how this film is when it came out, looking at it in retrospect, I can definitely see why the downward trend was continuing, at least financially, even though I don't agree with it. And of course, the next film can be one that I remember liking a little bit more than this, and unlike this one, it actually has gotten the live-action treatment recently. Of course, next is going to be the penultimate film in the Disney Renaissance, and that, of course, will be Mulan, but that is next time. Until then, everybody.